They scanned his mind to understand humanity. They created the instrument of their own defeat. The first thing Dren Voss noticed about the human was his hands, not his eyes, though those were unsettling enough. Those flat, pale irises that caught light the wrong way, the way water caught light at the bottom of a well. Not his smell, that particular musk of cortisol and soap, and something ferrous underneath, the biological advertisement of a creature perpetually preparing for a fight it hadn't started yet. No, it was the hands. Specifically, the way they moved when the human wasn't speaking. A slow, semi-conscious articulation of the fingers, like a musician running scales in a waiting room. Like something in him needed to keep practicing for a performance that never quite arrived. Dren Voss recorded it in his log the way he recorded everything. Methodically, without editorial weight, the way the Keth Val fleet required of all absorption specialists. But afterward, back in his observation pod, he replayed the footage 3 times. He had cataloged 41 sentient species in his career. He had pressed his consciousness against the cognitive architectures of silicon-based hive minds, gaseous collective intelligences, photosynthetic philosophers who thought in centuries. He had never once watched the recording of any subject 3 times. The human's name was Calder Mace, and he had been caught by a Keth Val scout patrol 7 weeks ago while piloting a single-person survey vessel through the disputed reach, which humans called the Kepler Belt, and the Keth Val called the Eneth Corridor, and which functionally belonged to whoever could enforce the claim hardest at any given moment. The Keth Val had been enforcing it very hard for the last 11 years. Calder Mace had apparently not received the updated cartography. He was being held in Cell Block 9 of the carrier Veth Karan, a vessel so large that it generated its own weather systems in the lower cargo decks. Dren Voss had requested transfer of the subject to his specialized research facility on the ship's 4th tier 3 weeks ago. The request had been denied twice by Admiral Kaketh Soon, who regarded the entire absorption program as an expensive indulgence and approved on the 3rd attempt, only because the Admiral had been presented with a cost-benefit analysis showing that extracting the human's military knowledge through absorption would be cheaper than a ground assault on the 3 human outer colony installations currently blocking the Keth Val expansion toward the Cassian cluster. Dren Voss had written that analysis himself. It had taken 40 minutes. He was very good at his work. The absorption specialist role within the Keth Val fleet structure was a minor one by status, significant by function. Dren Voss had been practicing it for 22 years. He had begun as a junior analyst in the Cultural Intelligence Division, cataloging communication patterns and social hierarchies for species encountered during the early expansion period, before the fleet had decided that expansion was not merely a scientific endeavor and had begun requiring its intelligence operations to produce outputs with direct military application. He had adapted. He was good at adapting. There was a quality he shared with the species he was about to spend 12 weeks studying, though he did not yet know that. The research facility was a long hexagonal room paneled in matte gray, with instruments arranged along the walls in careful sequences that conveyed seriousness without theatricality. Dren Voss had designed it himself. He had a deep and genuine aversion to spectacle. The absorption chamber itself occupied the center of the room. 2 chairs facing each other across a low table bearing the neural bridge equipment, a crown of thin filaments for the subject, a heavier induction array for the absorption specialist. Beside the equipment tray sat a glass of water and a small bowl of the dried fruit analog that the initial dietary assessment had flagged as acceptable for human metabolism. These details, the water, the fruit, were Dren Voss's own addition, not empathy, methodology. A subject who was not dying of dehydration produced higher fidelity neural signatures. At least, that was what he told himself in the part of his mind reserved for official justifications. He didn't examine the other part too closely. At OVO 800 ship time, on the morning of the first session, Dren Voss arrived at the facility and set out the water glass and the fruit bowl with the same careful deliberateness he brought to all preparations. He checked the neural bridge calibration. He reviewed his notes on human neurological architecture. He adjusted the lighting slightly, a fraction warmer than standard, because the pre-session scans had indicated that harsh blue spectrum lighting elevated human stress markers by approximately 8%, and elevated stress markers degraded absorption fidelity. Then he sat down and waited. Calder Mace was brought in by 2 guards at 0803. He was 34 years old, according to his vessel's crew manifest, with the particular physical density of someone who'd spent years in variable gravity environments, compact and deliberate in his movement, the kind of body that had learned to be efficient because inefficiency might mean tumbling through a hull breach. He had a scar along his left jaw that looked old, silvered by time, and another newer one along his right forearm that hadn't been in his medical file, which meant it had happened recently, possibly during the capture itself. He looked at the room with the particular expression of someone assessing a space they've never been in, but immediately understand the function of, not fear, exactly. More like recognition, the specific attention of someone who is very carefully learning the shape of the situation before committing to a response to it. Then he sat down in the offered chair with a composure that Dren Vos flagged in his log as atypical. Most subjects showed elevated distress markers at this stage: muscle tension, elevated respiratory rate, auditory scanning behavior. The involuntary suite of responses to perceived threat that the biological record showed was consistent across most carbon-based species. Calder Mace sat down, picked up the glass of water, and drank half of it without being invited to. Then he looked at Dren Vos. "You're different from the soldiers," he said. Dren Vos's translation matrix rendered it in under half a second. He had been studying Human Standard for 9 months in preparation for this assignment. He was nearly fluent. He had practiced in the evenings, alone in his quarters, speaking to recordings of human speech, news broadcasts, formal addresses, the casual conversations that human communications satellites broadcast on the civilian spectrum that Keth Val listening stations collected automatically. The casual conversations were the most useful for language acquisition and the most difficult because the grammar of human casual speech was not quite the same as formal speech. The same words arranged in structures that technically shouldn't work but did, producing meanings that the formal grammar failed to encode. He had pages of notes on it. "I am a researcher," Dren Vos said. In Human Standard, the words felt strange in his vocal apparatus, which was not designed for the particular fricatives of human speech, but passable. Calder Mace raised an eyebrow, just one. The asymmetry of the expression was fascinating. Dren Vos had cataloged over 200 distinct human facial configurations in his pre-assignment study and had noted, with considerable professional interest, that humans deployed micro-expressions as a form of layered communication that partially circumvented their own verbal outputs. In other words, humans frequently said one thing and simultaneously communicated something adjacent or contrary to it through their faces. It was not deception exactly, it was more like counterpoint, like a musical arrangement where the main melody and the bass line were telling slightly different stories. He had found this interesting in the abstract as a research finding. He was about to find out how much more interesting it was in practice. "A researcher," Calder Mace says. "What are you researching?" "You," Dren Vos said, "and through you, your species. I practice what we call absorption, the process of interfacing directly with a subject's cognitive architecture to map and internalize experiential knowledge. My intention is to understand humanity well enough to model your likely strategic responses to Keth Val expansion." He paused. "I tell you this because I've found subjects cooperate more effectively when they understand what is being asked of them." Calder Mace looked at the neural bridge equipment on the table between them, the crown of filaments, the induction array. Then he looked back at Dren Vos. "You're going to read my mind. I'm going to experience your memories, your emotional frameworks, your cognitive patterns. Read implies a passive process. Absorption is more participatory, and I don't have a choice about this. You have the choice to resist, but absorption works better when the subject doesn't. And what I extract from you will ultimately be used to make decisions about your species." Dren Vos let that sit for a moment. "I thought you might want to have some influence over how that process goes." Calder Mace looked at him for a long time. The hands, Dren Vos noticed, had gone still, the scale running stopped, whatever that meant. "All right," the human said, "let's do it your way." The first session lasted 4 hours. Standard for initial absorption with an uncooperative subject was 8 to 12 hours because the specialist had to fight through the subject's involuntary cognitive defenses, not deliberate resistance, necessarily, but the mind's instinctive response to an intrusion, the way a body raises a fever against an infection. With Calder Mace, Dren Vos was into the deep architecture within 40 minutes, and that was not because the human had failed to defend. It was because he hadn't tried to. He had just opened, stepped back, and waited. Dren Vos had not expected that. He had also not expected what he found there. The Keth Val model of mind was hierarchical and logical, memories stored as sequential data, emotional states functioning as calibration inputs for decision-making, identity maintained as a stable kernel around which all other cognitive processes orbited. When Dren Vos entered the mind of a Keth Val subject during training exercises, it was like walking through a well-organized library, comprehensible, navigable, orderly. The shelves went where they were supposed to go. The catalog made sense, the exits were clearly marked. Calder Mesa's mind was not a library. It was a city, and it was on fire, and also, it was raining, and somehow those two things were not in conflict. Memories didn't have a single fixed emotional valence. They shifted depending on when you access them, and from what angle, the way a single object could look completely different depending on the light. His childhood, a complex lattice of warmth and loss and humor and grief, all present simultaneously, none dominant. He had grown up in a mining colony in the outer belt. Dren Voss felt this through the sense memories, the recycled air and the low hum of the life support processors, and the specific quality of artificial light that never quite matched natural daylight, and that colonists either learned to ignore or learned to hate. His parents had been engineers. There was something large and complicated about the memory of them. Not painful exactly, not joyful exactly, something that was both of those things in the way that scar tissue was both the memory of a wound and the evidence of healing. His training came next. The years of deep space navigation certification, the apprenticeship under a survey captain he'd clearly both admired and feared. This part of the memory architecture was shot through with a wry, dark-edged amusement at his own younger self, a retrospective affection for past mistakes, a quality Dren Voss had never encountered in another species' cognitive record, and that he spent 20 minutes trying to categorize. It wasn't self-criticism, though self-criticism was present too. It wasn't nostalgia. It was more like the specific appreciation of someone watching a younger version of themselves make a predictable error and finding it entirely forgivable, fond. That was the word. The human was fond of his younger self's failures, his relationships, layered, contradictory, deeply personal in ways Dren Voss's analytical frameworks kept failing to fully parse. There were people in the memory architecture who occupied cognitive real estate far disproportionate to the calendar time spent with them. A crewmate from his first posting who had died in a pressure failure, a woman back on Earth he wrote letters to and hadn't seen in 3 years, an old teacher whose voice surfaced unbidden in moments of significant decision. Not ghosts, exactly. More like anchor points. Fixed stars by which the human navigated the less certain territory of his daily life. And underneath all of it, in the deepest substrate, something that Dren Voss could only describe as a quality of stubborn endurance. Not hope, exactly. Not defiance. More like a refusal to accept that any current state was final. A deep constitutional unwillingness to be done. It didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel performed. It felt like bedrock, like the load-bearing structure that everything else sat on top of. Dren Voss surfaced from the session with a throbbing pressure behind his sensory nodes and a feeling he didn't have a precise word for. He sat in his chair for a long time after the guards took Calder Mace back to cell block 9. He looked at the half-empty water glass. He looked at the untouched fruit bowl. Then he went back to his quarters and replayed the session footage for 3 hours. The second session was scheduled for the following day. When Dren Voss arrived at the facility, he found Calder Mace already sitting in his chair, the glass of water already half empty, the fruit bowl untouched. "Do you have any questions about yesterday?" Dren Voss asked. "Setting up the equipment." "Yeah," Calder Mace said. "What did you think?" It was not a question Dren Voss had been asked by a research subject before. He considered it for a moment, which was unusual. He didn't usually consider questions. He answered them. "You are considerably more complex than the Keth-Val analytical models predicted," he said finally. "Your species is considerably more complex. Is that good or bad, from your perspective?" "I haven't finished deciding," Calder Mace almost smiled. Almost. There was that counterpoint again. The slight upward curve of the mouth counterbalanced by something careful in the eyes, something that was watchful without being hostile. "Fair enough," he said. "Let's keep going." Over the next 6 weeks, they worked through the absorption sessions in what gradually became a recognizable rhythm. Not warmth exactly. Dren Voss was professional, and the professional framework required him to maintain appropriate distance from his subjects. But something that functioned like ease, a working relationship that had calibrated itself to mutual efficiency. Dren Voss had initially estimated 8 to 10 sessions would be sufficient to produce the strategic analysis Admiral Kethsoon required. By session 4, he had extended that estimate to 15. By session 7, he had stopped estimating. The problem, and he was honest enough with himself to call it a problem, to sit with the discomfort of that word was not that he wasn't extracting useful information. He was. Calder Mace was a survey specialist with deep knowledge of the outer colony infrastructure, the human fleet's logistical patterns, the political fault lines between Earth Command and the colonial administration. All of it was going into Dren Voss's reports, Neatly organized, professionally presented, stripped of the emotional context that made it difficult to process. The problem was the other things. The jokes. Calder Mace told jokes, not to amuse Dren Vos, but apparently as a cognitive habit, a way of reframing difficult situations to make them manageable. Self-deprecating jokes, mostly, and jokes about mortality delivered with an airy lightness that had initially read to Dren Vos as pathological but that he was now beginning to understand as a sophisticated coping mechanism, a way of looking directly at terrible things without being destroyed by them. The joke was a form of distance that was also a form of engagement. It lets you hold the terrible thing at arm's length long enough to examine it, and then set it down. He told one in the third session about a human navigator who gets lost in a nebula and responds to it by making increasingly detailed to-do lists. The punchline was that the to-do lists are all still there when they find the wreck. 17 lists, all color-coded, none of them useful. Calder Mace told it in a tone of complete deadpan neutrality, and Dren Vos's translation matrix rendered it faithfully. And it wasn't until 6 hours later that Dren Vos understood that it was funny and why. The why was important. The joke was about the human impulse to impose order on chaos even when the chaos was winning. The navigator knew the lists were useless. That wasn't the point. The point was the act of making them, the refusal to simply sit in the dark and wait for the end. It was funny because it was true, and it was sad because it was true, and it was admirable because it was true, and all three of those things were present simultaneously in a single well-constructed joke, which was, Dren Vos noted this in his log at length, a more efficient information delivery system than most of the official reports he filed. The music. Calder Mates had grown up in a colony station that ran on recycled atmosphere and pirated data feeds, and somewhere in that upbringing he'd absorbed an enormous library of human music from across 8 centuries, and it turned out human music was Dren Vos was still processing this. A non-verbal cognitive architecture in its own right. A parallel system for encoding and transmitting emotional information that bypassed the filter of rational language and arrived directly at something older and harder to articulate. When Dren Vos touched the musical memories in Session 5, he felt things he didn't have Kethval words for. He sat in his quarters afterward for 2 hours, very still, trying to figure out what those things were. He eventually decided they were a category of experience that the Kethval cognitive framework simply didn't have a slot for, and that trying to force them into existing categories would produce something accurate the way a translated poem was accurate. Technically correct, missing the point entirely. He stopped trying to categorize and just let the feeling be there. It was uncomfortable. He did it anyway. The stories. Calder Mace was constitutionally a storyteller. In the way that some people were constitutionally dark-haired or left-handed, it was simply a feature of how he was built. He stored experience as narrative. He understood the world through the lenses of plot and character. Even his strategic knowledge, the military logistics, the colony defense layouts, was wrapped in stories about specific people and specific moments, not because he lacked the capacity for abstraction, but because Dren Vos was slowly realizing narrative was not a weaker form of knowledge. It was a different form of knowledge, one that had its own structural advantages. A map stored as data was only accessible as data. A map stored as a story, as the account of a particular person making a particular journey through a particular landscape with particular consequences, was also stored in the emotional memory, the sensory memory, the contextual memory. It was backed up across multiple cognitive systems simultaneously. It was significantly more durable under conditions of trauma or stress. And it was transmissible in ways that data alone wasn't, because story engaged the listener's own emotional and narrative architecture in ways that data didn't. Dren Vos filed a 7-page addendum to his standard research notes on this topic alone. He marked it internal analysis. Not for distribution, which was, strictly speaking, irregular. He filed it anyway. After Session 11, Dren Vos wrote an updated report for Admiral Kethsoon that included, for the first time, a formal recommendation against full military engagement with the human outer colonies. Not a soft recommendation, a hard one, with supporting evidence, clearly argued. The Admiral called him to a meeting within the hour. Her command deck occupied the prow of the Veth Quran, a cathedral-scale space of screens and tactical displays, and the soft, persistent hum of systems monitoring 1,100 crew. Admiral Kethsoon herself was old by Kethval standards. Her secondary sensory membranes had gone the amber of late age, and she had the deliberate stillness of someone who had spent decades learning not to move more than necessary. She had commanded this fleet for 19 years. She had directed 12 successful expansions. She had never lost a contested installation. Your research was supposed to give us a strategic advantage, she said. Not give me reasons to hesitate. The reasons to hesitate were always present, Dren Voss said. I have simply made them visible. The humans are technologically inferior. Their fleet response time to the Kepler belt is 6 weeks minimum. Their outer colonies are underdefended. These are facts. They are. But the conclusions you're drawing from those facts are incomplete. He had prepared a supplementary analysis. He presented it now, 23 pages, with charts, with probability matrices, with the specific kind of dense analytical scaffolding that Fleet Command respected, because it looked like the kind of thinking they were already doing, but with better numbers. He had learned, over 22 years, how to present ideas that made people uncomfortable in the language that would make them most digestible. It was not deception, it was translation. It was the same skill that let a story carry a map. The core argument was this. The Kethval had been assessing the humans through the lens of Kethval strategic psychology, which prioritized efficient resource allocation, predictable risk tolerance, and rational cost-benefit calculus. By these measures, the humans were outmatched. Their technology was behind. Their numbers in the disputed reach were thin. Their political cohesion was fractured by the ongoing tensions between Earth Command and the colonial government. Metric that Kethval strategic doctrine considered relevant showed a species that could be subdued with acceptable resource expenditure. But these assessments were missing something fundamental. They were measuring whether the humans were good at fighting the way the Kethval fought, not whether they were good at fighting. The humans were extremely good at fighting. They were just good at it in ways that Kethval models didn't account for. They were good at improvising under conditions of catastrophic information loss. When the plan was gone and the communications were down, and the situation had stopped resembling anything they'd prepared for, they generated new approaches rather than freezing or retreating to protocol. The protocol for humans was to not have a protocol for the specific situation, but to have a general capacity for rapid in-context problem solving that produced something protocol-like on the fly. They were good at absorbing early defeats and continuing. Kethval strategic doctrine assumed that a sufficiently decisive early engagement would break an opponent's will to continue. This assumption was based on the documented response of every species the Kethval had engaged so far. It did not apply to the humans, whose historical record, and Dren Voss had read a great deal of human history in the past 6 weeks, showed a consistent pattern of absorbing catastrophic defeats and then, against all rational expectation, not stopping. They were good at motivating one another through narrative and symbol in ways that amplified combat effectiveness far beyond what individual capability metrics suggested. A human unit that was fighting for something it could tell a story about was meaningfully different, in operational terms, from the same unit fighting for a strategic objective with no narrative context. This was not irrational. It was a different kind of rationality, one that operated on different inputs. And they had a property that Dren Voss had come to think of, lacking a more precise Kethval term, as creativity under pressure. The ability to generate novel solutions by combining existing knowledge in ways that hadn't been combined before, specifically in situations where normal options had failed. It was not intelligence, exactly. It was something adjacent to intelligence and possibly more dangerous than intelligence. The willingness to be wrong in interesting ways, to try things that weren't supposed to work, and to keep trying them until something finally did. The outer colonies are a trap, Dren Voss said. They're underdefended now, because the humans want us to think they're underdefended. If we move on them, we will not be fighting 3 small installations. We will be fighting the entire human strategic imagination, with those installations as the fulcrum. Admiral Keth soon set down the report. Her secondary sensory membranes had gone the deep amber of concentration. She looked at the probability matrices. She looked at the historical record excerpts. She looked at the cognitive architecture diagrams, which Dren Voss had worked very hard to make accessible to someone with no absorption training. This is based on what you extracted from one prisoner, she said. A survey specialist, not a military planner, not a fleet commander. It is based on what I extracted from one human, yes, but one human contains multitudes. That is not a poetic sentiment. It is literally structurally accurate. The patterns I have identified are not individual variations. They are species constants. I have now studied 12 humans from various backgrounds and service records, and these properties are consistent across all of them. He paused. They are all like him, like your prisoner. Yes. The Admiral was quiet for a moment. She looked at him with an expression that Dren Voss, with his 11 weeks of human expression analysis, couldn't quite read. Then she looked back at the report. Make sure your prisoner hasn't done it to you, she said. He thought about that for a long time after he left the Admiral's office. He went to session 12 with that thought, sitting quietly behind his professional calm. He set up the equipment carefully. He put the water glass out. He did not put out the fruit bowl. Calder Mace had told him 3 sessions ago, in a tone of extremely mild exasperation, that he didn't actually like dried fruit. He'd specified this in a way that suggested the mildness of the exasperation was itself communicating something, not complaint, but the particular casualness of someone who has decided at some point to stop performing patience around a minor inconvenience, as though something between them had shifted enough that pretending to like the fruit was no longer worth the effort. Drenvas had noted this in his log as increased baseline authenticity, session 9 onward. He had sat with that for a while too. Calder Mace looked at the empty space where the bowl usually sat, then at Drenvas. You remembered, he said. I am thorough, Drenvas said. Yeah, Calder Mace said, you are. They worked through the session in their established rhythm, and Drenvas navigated the now familiar architecture with the ease that came from repeated traversal. He knew where the difficult access points were, which emotional saturations required patience, which areas Calder Mace surfaced voluntarily, versus the regions where he went quiet and waited. He had learned the cognitive geography of this particular mind the way a navigator learned a coast. Not just the landmarks, but the currents, the places where the water did unexpected things. About 2 hours in, he found something new. It was deep in the strategic memory architecture, behind an access point that had been, in earlier sessions, surrounded by what he could only describe as emotional noise, strong enough to deflect attention elsewhere, not a deliberate shield. Grief, Drenvas had assessed it and he had documented it and moved on, because extracting information from areas of acute emotional saturation required either time or force, and Drenvas preferred time. The grief was still there, but today it was quieter. What was behind it was a map, not a physical map, it was more abstract than that, a framework, a model. It took Drenvas several minutes of careful navigation to understand what he was looking at. And then he understood, and he stopped moving, and he sat in the cognitive landscape of Calder Mace's mind for a long moment, very still. Calder Mace had built a model of Drenvas's psychology, not a complete one, not a detailed one. The human didn't have access to most of the information that would make it detailed. But it was real, it was present, and it had been constructed over the course of their sessions with the same methodical patience that Drenvas had used to map Calder, Mace's cognitive architecture. The human had been watching him, studying him, noticing the questions that made Drenvas pause, the subjects that made his query patterns shift, the moments when his professional composure showed the hairline cracks of genuine interest. From those observations, he had built a working model of how Drenvas thought. And inside that model, cross-reference with the framework, Calder Mace had stored something. A series of cognitive pointers, markers indicating specific memories that had been surfaced in previous sessions, carefully chosen. Drenvas traced them, the memory of the navigator joke and the days it had taken to understand it. The evening sessions with the music catalog, which Calder Mace had observed through the way the absorption felt different on the days after Drenvas had been listening, something slightly warmer in the access, some quality of approach that differed from the purely analytical norm. The moments when Drenvas had asked follow-up questions he didn't need to ask because the strategic information was already captured and the follow-up was driven by something else. Curiosity, genuine curiosity, not professional, personal. Calder Mace had noticed it, marked it, built around it. Drenvas surfaced from the absorption session. Calder Mace was watching him. The expression on his face was neutral, which Drenvas had learned to read as deliberate neutrality, the conscious suppression of some other expression, the human said. Yes, a moment. How long ago did you build it? Calder Mace thought about it, head tilted slightly to one side, the gesture that meant genuine consideration, as opposed to the performance of consideration. Around session 3, I started paying attention to what you were paying attention to. The model itself, probably week 4, give or take. I kept updating it. It's more accurate now than when I started. You've been managing my absorption process. I've been trying to make sure you were seeing the things that mattered. And what things, Drenvas said quietly, do you think matter? That we're not what you think we are. Not just soldiers, not just a strategic problem. You've been pulling military logistics out of me for weeks, and I've been letting you, because that part doesn't matter as much as the Admiral thinks it does. She's going to use it to plan the assault. And that's... He stopped. Something moved across his face. But the other stuff. The stuff that's actually true about us, I needed you to get that too. Not because I thought it would change anything necessarily. Just because it was true, and you seemed like someone who cared about getting things right. Drenvas was silent. The map you found, Caldermace continued. The markers, those are the memories I most wanted you to keep. After I'm gone, after whatever decision gets made, I wanted someone in your fleet to actually know what they're dealing with. You're trying to save your species, Drenvas said. I'm trying to make sure someone remembers them accurately. The human was quiet for a moment. There's a difference. Drenvas left the session without the standard debrief. He walked to his quarters, sat down at his workstation, and spent 4 hours going through every flag Caldermace had placed, every marked memory, every indicated moment. He cataloged them, analyzed them, and then, in a breach of professional protocol so clean and complete that he knew immediately it was not going in any report, he did something his training specifically told him not to do. He synthesized them. He let them sit together in his working memory as a coherent whole, the way memories sat in a human mind, not as data points but as a portrait, not what a human could do, what a human was. The jokes and the music and the stories and the navigator lists, and the stubborn absolute refusal to accept the current state as final, and the specific warmth that the human showed toward its own past mistakes, and the way that warmth was extended outward to other humans, and apparently, in some cases, to non-humans who asked the right questions in the right light. Humanity, flawed, asymmetrical, loud, full of counterpoint, constitutionally unwilling to be done. He thought about the Admiral's question, about deception, and he decided, with the careful precision he brought to all his conclusions, that the answer was no. That what Caldermace had done was not deception. It was the opposite of deception. He had spent 11 weeks making sure a member of an alien species that was planning his species' subjugation would see them clearly. That was not manipulation. That was an act of faith. The kind that didn't require the outcome to justify itself. He wrote the updated report that night, the Category 5 recommendation. He filed it at 0300, and then lay down on his sleeping surface and thought about a joke. A human engineer and an alien engineer. The human fixes the air recycler, but takes 4 times as long, because they stop halfway through to argue about the best way to do it. He had been thinking about that joke for 3 days. He was thinking about it again now. The punchline was the argument. He was beginning to understand why. The response came in 18 hours. Admiral Keth Soon called him to her command deck at 0900, presented the counter-authorization signed by 4 senior fleet commanders, and reclassified the recommendation. Category 2, she said. Manageable resistance. The asymmetry of force is not the relevant variable, Drenvas said. It is the only variable I am authorized to act on. He recognized, with the particular clarity that came at the end of long processes, that the conversation was over. He left the command deck, walked to the research facility, and sat down across from Caldermace. The human looked at him. Whatever he read in Drenvas's posture or expression, and after 12 weeks he was very good at reading it, was sufficient. He didn't ask how the meeting had gone. They're moving forward, Caldermace said. Yes. When? 11 days. The fleet will position in the outer reach within 72 hours. Caldermace was quiet. He looked at his hands. Drenvas had been watching those hands for 12 weeks. He had spent considerable time analyzing the way they moved when Caldermace was thinking, the same slow-scale running articulation he'd noticed in the first session. Fingers flexing and releasing in a sequence, like a rehearsal, like practicing for something. Watching them now, something in the Kethval analog to a chest cavity did something unfamiliar, a pressure that wasn't physical pain. The data I extracted, he said, the military information. It will be used in the assault planning. I know. I'm sorry. Caldermace looked up. The expression on his face was one Drenvas hadn't cataloged before, something complex, something that had warmth in it and sadness in it, and something else, underneath both, something the frameworks kept failing to fully name. You didn't have a choice, the human said. I didn't attempt sufficiently hard to find one. They looked at each other for a moment. There's one thing I didn't show you, Caldermace said. One thing I kept back. The words landed in the room differently from his usual speech. Quieter, less practiced. Not to hide from you. I kept it back because I wasn't sure how to shape it so you'd understand it correctly. And then 11 weeks went by, and I still wasn't sure, but now there's 11 days, and I'd rather you understand it wrong than not at all. What is it? The human reached up and placed 2 fingers at his temple, pressing once, twice, a gesture Drenvas had seen him use twice before in moments of high significance, like a mnemonic device, like pressing a thumbprint into wax. There's a relay station, he said. Outpost 7 Kappa on the far edge of the Cassian cluster. It looks like a dead installation on your maps. Abandoned. No power signature. No active transponder. Your scouts have passed it 17 times in the last 2 years and logged it as non-functional. It isn't. No. Drenvos looked at him carefully. What is it? It's a communications relay. And it's been collecting every scan your fleet has done of the outer colonies for the last 2 years. Not the content of the scans, just the pattern of them. Where you look, how often, what you prioritize. Caldermace paused. Someone on Earth Command is very good at paying attention to what other people are paying attention to. Drenvos thought about the map inside the map, about cognitive pointers, about 12 weeks of strategic patience, building a working model from the available evidence. They built a model, he said, yeah, of the Kethval fleet's analytical process. They started about 3 years ago, when it became clear you were moving toward the Reach. It took them a while to understand what you were looking for. But once they did, once they understood how your scouts prioritize targets, what your fleet considers a credible threat versus noise, they started designing around it. The colony defenses you've allowed us to see are the ones we wanted you to see. Drenvos was very still. We've been managing the absorption process, Caldermace said. Not just me here, in this room, the whole species. For 3 years. I told you we were capable of acting genuinely while also strategically. His hands had gone still in his lap. I'm being genuine right now. But yes, I was also sent on that survey mission, knowing there was a chance I'd be captured, and knowing what I was supposed to show you if I was. Drenvos thought about the assault scheduled in 11 days, about 4 senior fleet commanders and a counter-authorization, about Category 2 and manageable resistance. Why are you telling me now, he said, if the plan is already in motion? Because the plan doesn't need me anymore. You've filed your reports. The fleet is committed. Whatever happens next is going to happen regardless of what I tell you. A pause. He looked at his hands again. But you spent 12 weeks trying to understand us correctly. That deserved the truth. The relay station, Drenvos said. What does it do beyond collecting scans? It transmits, every 6 hours, to the Cassian cluster installations. Full position and movement data for every Kethval vessel in the Reach. For 3 years. For 3 years, Drenvos calculated. He was very fast at calculations. 3 years of position and movement data, cross-referenced with Kethval fleet protocols and tactical doctrine, fed to the installations that were supposed to be underdefended. 3 years of watching how the Kethval watched. 3 years of designing the response around the precise shape of the threat. The assault was scheduled in 11 days. The fleet would position in the outer Reach in 72 hours. Admiral Keth Soon's 4 senior fleet commanders had signed off on a strategic assessment that was, he saw it clearly now, with the cold, perfect clarity of someone who had just understood a joke long after it was told. Missing. Its own punchline. He stood up. I need to file a report, he said. I know. It will flag your information. There will be consequences for you. Caldermace looked up at him. That expression again. Warmth and sadness, and the other thing underneath that his frameworks kept failing to name, and that he thought he was finally, after 12 weeks, beginning to understand. I know, the human said. File it. Drenvos stopped at the door, turned back. The joke, he said. The engineer joke. The punchline. They stop halfway through to argue about the best way to do it. I've been thinking about for several days. Yeah, the argument isn't inefficiency. They're not arguing about the method. They're updating their model of the problem in real time. The argument is the process. It's how they make sure the fix is right instead of just fast. Caldermace looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, fully, completely. Both melody and bassline, aligned for once. No counterpoint. There it is, he said. Took you long enough. Drenvos filed the report at 1100 ship time, not to Admiral Keth Soon, but through a direct channel to Kethval Strategic High Command, that he had been technically authorized to use only in cases of species-level strategic threat, a category he had never invoked. He invoked it now. The report was 41 pages. Everything. The relay station, the 3 years of movement data, the human cognitive architecture and its implications for asymmetric warfare, the Category 5 reclassification with full supporting evidence, and at the end, in a short appendix that had no place in a formal intelligence report and that he included anyway. What we are facing is not a species that is simply inferior to us in firepower and technology, and that will therefore yield when those asymmetries are applied. What we are facing is a species whose primary strategic asset is not firepower or technology or numbers. It is the capacity to keep fighting after all rational calculation has counseled surrender. It is the ability to generate, under conditions of maximum pressure and minimum resource, solutions that were not in any prior strategic model. It is the willingness to be wrong in interesting ways, and to keep being wrong until something finally works. I do not use the word genius loosely. I use it in the only sense I now consider accurate, not the genius of individuals who exceed their species, but the genius of a species that has built the capacity for creative resilience into its fundamental cognitive architecture. We are not going to defeat them by being stronger. We are going to have to be, if anything, better at learning than they are at adapting. And based on 12 weeks of direct observation, I am not confident that we are. He read it over 3 times, then he sent it. The response from High Command arrived in 4 hours. Admiral Keth Soon arrived in his research facility 14 minutes after that. She stood in the doorway and looked at the 2 chairs and looked at Dren Voss and didn't say anything for a moment. "You invoked direct channel," she said. "Yes. High Command has suspended the assault authorization pending review. A pause. 72 hours. They want the relay station independently verified, and they want your full absorption logs from all 12 sessions." Dren Voss passed them to her. The Admiral stood for a moment in the matte gray light, looking at nothing in particular. Old and very still, performing a private recalibration. "The Category 5 recommendation," she said. "Even in the direct channel. Yes, it will cost us the Cassian cluster expansion window. Probably. 12 weeks, the Admiral said, sitting with one human in a room. Yes. Something moved through her expression, not quite the counterpoint Dren Voss had learned to read in human faces, but something analogous to it. Something that wasn't fully resolved. "Your prisoner," she said. "What will happen to him now?" "That depends on the review findings. I'm asking what you intend to recommend." Dren Voss was quiet for a moment. "Release," he said. "Safe return to human space with full diplomatic status. His vessel should be returned." The Admiral nodded. One short, precise nod. She left. Dren Voss sat in his chair in the empty research facility and looked at the 2 chairs facing each other across the low table. He looked at the water glass, nearly empty. He looked at the empty space where the fruit bowl had not been. He wrote the release recommendation in 40 minutes. It was thorough. He was very good at his work. The verification teams reached Outpost 7 Kappa 14 hours later. The relay station was exactly where Calder Mace had said it would be, positioned in a sensor shadow produced by the overlap of 2 scanning systems that had each been individually calibrated under the assumption that the other was covering the blind spot. It had been designed to be missed. It had been designed by people who understood, very precisely, how Kethval scanners worked and what they were looking for. 3 years of Kethval fleet movement. Cataloged, transmitted, received. The assault authorization remained suspended. Diplomatic channels opened 3 weeks later. The news of what humans called first contact reached the outer colonies 4 months after the assault had been scheduled to begin. The people in those colonies, who had been waiting for 11 months in installations designed around a precisely modeled prediction of attack, vectors, received it with the particular mixture of relief and dark humor, and residual tension that Dren Voss was coming to recognize as the standard human response to the resolution of existential threat. They had known the assault was coming. They had prepared. They had waited in carefully underdefended installations that were not actually underdefended, with a relay station transmitting enemy position data every 6 hours, and they had kept updating their models. They had been ready to fight. They were pleased not to have to. In the command center of the largest installation, the one designated as the primary target of the assault that never happened, there was a whiteboard. Someone had written on it sometime in the weeks before the stand down. Dren Voss learned about it from a diplomatic cultural exchange packet 3 months later and cataloged it carefully. "We do not accept the current state as final." Below it, in different handwriting, added more recently, "We never did." He added it to his research notes under the heading he had been using for 12 years now, "Species Constants." 6 months after the stand down, Calder Mace was returned to human space on a Kethval diplomatic transport. His survey vessel traveled alongside, recovered and repaired. The handover was a minor diplomatic event, notable mostly for the fact that neither side was entirely sure of the protocol, because there wasn't one. This was a new situation. Dren Voss attended. It was not required of him. He went anyway. The transport bay was large and echoing, smelling of machine oil and recycled atmosphere and the specific tension that occupied spaces where important things were happening with insufficient ceremony. Calder Mace walked out of the Kethval side and stopped at the median line. A human diplomatic attaché walked forward to meet him. There was a brief formal exchange, and then Calder Mace was officially, technically, back in human space. He looked across the bay at Dren Voss. He raised one hand, palm out, general greeting, no hostile intent, per the briefing documents. But Dren Voss had spent 12 weeks studying the gestural lexicon of this specific human, and he recognized the particular warmth in the posture of the arm, the specific quality of the eye contact. Not a formal greeting, a personal one, dressed in formal clothes. Dren Voss raised his hand in return. He had practiced the gesture. It came out reasonably well. Then Calder Mace did something else. He raised 2 fingers to his temple and pressed once, twice. The emphasis gesture. Something important is here. Then he pointed to Dren Voss. Then he turned and walked through the doorway into human space, and the bay doors sealed, and the transport undocked with the soft mechanical precision of a well-engineered system performing its designed function, indifferent to the weight of the moment. Dren Voss stood in the echoing bay for a moment, then he turned and walked back toward his work. The reach adjustment took 11 years to fully negotiate. There were 3 breakdowns, 2 near returns to hostility, 1 spectacular diplomatic incident involving a misunderstanding about silence at a formal dinner that set the talks back 8 months and generated a 2,000-word addendum to the cultural exchange protocols. Dren Voss was present for all of it. He filed 1,742 pages of research notes over those years. He cataloged 89 human subjects and produced 16 absorption-based reports that Kethval Strategic High Command rated as the most accurate intelligence outputs in the history of the program. He was promoted 4 times. He was reprimanded twice, once for the initial direct channel report, once for an addendum to a standard strategic assessment that High Command classified as editorializing and that Dren Voss classified as necessary context. He included the context anyway both times. He learned to tell jokes. Not well. Humor was a cognitive technology that required years of calibration for a non-native user, and the calibration was complicated by the fact that what was funny in one human cultural context was not funny in another, and what was funny to Kethval observers was frequently not what humans intended to be funny, and the whole business was a navigational challenge that he found increasingly enjoyable rather than frustrating. He learned to try. He learned to read the specific quality of human amusement at a failed joke, the warmth in it, the appreciation for the attempt itself. He learned that this, too, was a form of communication. He learned more of the music. He had a catalog of 712 pieces now, annotated with the emotional architectures they encoded. He listened to them in the evenings, very still in his quarters, feeling things he sometimes still didn't have Kethval words for and had mostly stopped worrying about. He learned to sit comfortably with the counterpoint. Main melody and bass line saying slightly different things. He had come to think of it not as inconsistency, but as richness, the cognitive signature of a species capable of holding 2 true things simultaneously, even when they didn't fully resolve. In the 12th year of the negotiations, the final treaty was ratified. At the ceremony, the human delegation lead gave a speech that Dren Voss recorded in full and translated carefully and added to his notes. "We didn't want this fight," she said, "and we're glad it didn't happen. And we're not done arguing about the best way to make sure it doesn't happen again." He added it to the species constants file. It seemed to belong there. Years after the reach adjustment had become history, a young absorption specialist in training approached Dren Voss after a lecture and asked him what was the most important thing he had learned in his career. He thought about it. He thought about hands, about jokes, about music, about the map inside the map and the relay station, and 3 years of strategic patience building toward a moment that almost wasn't witnessed. He thought about a man sitting in a gray room drinking half a glass of water without being invited to, and deciding calmly to spend 11 weeks making sure one member of an alien species would see his people clearly. He thought about 2 words on a whiteboard. We never did. He thought about 2 fingers pressed to a temple. The most important thing, Dren Voss said, is to understand that intelligence is not the variable. Adaptability is the variable. And adaptability requires, as its prerequisite, the willingness to be wrong. He paused. Humans are the best I have ever encountered at being wrong productively, at being wrong in ways that generate new information rather than merely confirming the loss. I have spent my career trying to understand how they do it. The trainee nodded, writing things down. And have you figured it out? The trainee asked. Dren Voss smiled. He had gotten better at smiling over the years. It was still not quite right by Kethval standards, but he had stopped worrying about that. I am still updating my model, he said. It was the most honest answer he had ever given, and it was, he thought, exactly what the human would have said. There was a particular quality to the silence in the research facility between sessions. Dren Voss had noted it during the 3rd week, not an absence of sound, since the Veth Quran was never truly silent, its systems producing a permanent low-register hum that you stopped consciously hearing after about 4 days of bored. This was a different quality, the silence of a room that was waiting for something. He had never thought of rooms as waiting before. He was not sure he had thought in those terms before. During the period when Calder Mace was not present, Dren Vaz spent the session's time doing what he always did between appointments: writing, reviewing, cross-referencing. He maintained 3 separate log files. The first was the official absorption record, which contained the strategic intelligence extracted from each session and was filed with Fleet Command on a weekly basis. The second was his personal research notes, the observations about human cognitive architecture, the cataloged anomalies, the emergent patterns. The third was something he hadn't planned and had no official designation for, a running record of things that had surprised him. He had never kept a file like that before. The existence of it was, in itself, data. On the morning before Session 8, he read through the file. It had grown to 37 pages. Things that had surprised him in approximate order: the hands, the fact that Calder Mace had asked what he thought, the music, specifically the way it felt to experience music that wasn't Kethval, which wasn't better or worse than Kethval music, but was genuinely different in ways that seemed to open up something he hadn't known was closed. The joke about the navigator and the color-coded lists. The memory of Calder Mace's mother teaching him a song from her own childhood, a song she had learned from a woman who had died 40 years before Calder Mace was born. So the song was a transmission across 3 generations, each person who sang it carrying someone else's memory in their voice. That one had kept Dren Vaz awake for most of a night. He had tried to explain why to himself and failed, which was its own kind of surprise. The way Calder Mace talked about the people he'd lost. Not with grief exactly. Grief was present, documented accurately, but it wasn't the dominant register. It was more like carrying. The way the mind of someone who had lost people continued to carry those people, continued to run models of how they would have responded to new situations, continued to speak with them in some functional internal space that wasn't quite conversation and wasn't quite memory and wasn't quite prayer, but had something of all 3. The humans Calder Mace had known who were dead were not, in any cognitive sense, entirely gone. They were still present in the architecture of his mind, still influencing his decisions, still, in some way Dren Vaz's frameworks kept struggling to categorize, still there. He had added this to his species contents file with the note: investigation required, extended timeline. On the morning before Session 8, sitting with his 3 files and the low hum of the ship around him, Dren Vaz did something that had also never happened before. He found himself hoping the session would go well, not in a professional sense, in a personal sense. He noticed the quality of the hope, turned it over, and decided that acknowledging it honestly was better than pretending it wasn't there. He was learning from his subject, more than the subject knew, more, possibly, than he'd been authorized to learn. That thought sat with him through the morning. Session 8 began as they all did. The neural bridge calibration, the water glass, the absence of the fruit bowl. Calder Mace sat down with the practiced ease of someone who had made peace with the routine. The guards left. Dren Vaz fitted the filament crown and adjusted the induction array. "Before we start," Calder Mace said. Dren Vaz paused. Pre-session dialogue was unusual. He documented it. "What is it? I want to know something." Calder Mace looked at him directly, with the particular quality of directness that Dren Vaz had come to recognize as the register humans used when they had decided to ask a difficult question and had committed to asking it regardless of how it landed. "Do you have people? Back wherever you're from, when you're not on this ship, people you carry with you?" Dren Vaz was quiet for a moment. "There is a partner," he said. "We have been bonded for 14 years. There are 2 offspring, both in early education," he considered. "There are colleagues who matter to me. A teacher from my training who died 11 years ago." He paused. Yes, I have people." Calder Mace nodded. Something in his face resolved, as though the answer had confirmed something he'd been testing for. "I ask because," he said, "I've been trying to figure out why I'm cooperating with this. More than I should be, probably. Strategically speaking," he looked at his hands. "And I think part of it is that you seem like someone who has people, someone who understands what it means to have them." His voice was level, matter of fact. "It makes it feel less like I'm talking to a weapon." "I am not a weapon," Dren Vaz said. "Your work is." The statement sat between them. "Yes," Dren Vaz said, "my work is." They looked at each other. Calder Mace nodded once, slowly, not agreement, more like acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of something true and unpleasant that didn't need to be argued about. "All right," he said. "Let's work." It was the best session they'd had. Dren Vaz documented it thoroughly and filed the strategic components in the weekly report, and then sat for a long time in the quiet room, thinking about the word weapon and what it meant to carry it. Session 10 produced the first significant complication. They were 2 hours in, navigating one of the more difficult areas of the cognitive architecture, the period surrounding a mission 4 years ago that had ended in the deaths of 2 of Calder Mesa's crewmates, a pressure failure in a corridor he had not been in, when Dren Voss touched a memory that had not been there in Session 8. New memories were documented irregularly during extended absorption projects. The brain continued processing and filing experience even during the research period, and fresh memories sometimes appeared between sessions. What was unusual about this one was its location. It was positioned not in the recent experience section of the architecture, where new memories typically resided, but deep in the strategic framework adjacent to a region Dren Voss had not yet had access to. The memory was of a conversation, Calder Mace, and a voice that Dren Voss couldn't immediately place, low and fast, recorded with the slight distortion of a compressed transmission. The content was mostly technical: coordinates, timing references, what sounded like system codes, and then one phrase that was not technical at all: the relay station will do the rest. Calder Mace was not asleep during absorption. He was in a state of cooperative reduced consciousness that allowed the neural bridge to function while leaving a thin layer of active awareness. Dren Voss had observed over 10 sessions that this thin layer was more active than standard. The human was not merely passive. He was present. He was present now. That was new, Calder Mason said. Yes. Dren Voss kept his voice level. Would you like to tell me about it? It wasn't a question exactly, but it wasn't a demand either. He had learned over 10 sessions that this particular register, informational, open, not aggressive, was more likely to produce voluntary disclosure than the formal interrogation register he'd been trained to use. The human was quiet for a long moment. Not today, he said. 2 more sessions, then I'll show you. Dren Voss documented this and moved on. He did not file it in the weekly report. He sat with the knowledge of that omission for a long time afterward, testing it from various angles, unable to find a professional justification for it, finding it anyway. Session 11, the last one before the map inside the map. They had established, by this point, a working rhythm that neither of them had designed, and both of them operated within unconsciously. Dren Voss arrived at the facility 7 minutes before Calder Mace. Calder Mace arrived with the guards, sat down, picked up the water glass. The guards left. Dren Voss adjusted the calibration. There were small individual variations that had emerged over 10 sessions, a particular sensitivity on the left side of the neural interface that required compensating for. He had learned this the way you learned the quirks of any system you worked with closely, gradually, through attention, through the accumulation of small corrections. It was, he realized, exactly the same process by which Calder Mace had learned him. That session was different from the outset. There was a quality to the architecture that Dren Voss recognized, after 2 hours of careful navigation, as preparation. The cognitive pathways that led toward the areas they'd been working through were subtly open, not the usual mild resistance that required patient navigation, but something almost organized, as if the territory had been cleared. Near the end of the session, Dren Voss found himself in a region he hadn't accessed before. High strategic architecture, recent, built with the kind of careful layering that suggested deliberate construction rather than organic memory formation. It was, he noted this with the focused calm he used when things surprised him significantly, built around a specific shape. A shape that, once he traced its outlines, was recognizable. It was built around Dren Voss himself, around what Dren Voss would notice, what he would follow, what questions he would ask, around a model of his curiosity, meticulously constructed from 10 sessions of observing how it worked. And in the center of that shape, waiting, the relay station, the map, the 3 years of fleet movements, the real architecture of what humanity had been building while the Kethval fleet had measured the visible surface of what humanity was. Calder Mace had built a delivery system for the thing he needed Dren Voss to find. He had built it out of 10 weeks of watching Dren Voss watch him. Dren Voss surfaced from the session. He sat in his chair. He looked at Calder Mace, who was watching him with the particular careful neutrality of someone who knows they've just shown their hand and is waiting to see what happens next. Tomorrow, Dren Voss said. Session 12. Yeah, Calder Mace said. Session 12. There was a part of the Veth Karan that Dren Voss had discovered in his 2nd week aboard. A small observation bay in the ship's lower tier, just forward of the engineering section, which had a viewport that faced the direction of travel and which was almost never occupied. He had started going there in the evenings, between sessions and reports, to look at the stars. The stars in the Neth corridor were not significantly different from stars anywhere else in this region of the galaxy, but they were the stars that happened to be visible from where he was, and there was something about sitting in a quiet room looking at them that he found useful. Not productive, exactly. Just useful. He went to the evening before session 12. He sat in the viewport alcove and looked at the stars and thought about personality copying. He thought about the original problem the absorption program had been designed to solve. Not intelligence gathering, actually, in its earliest incarnation. The program was 30 years old and had been designed by a researcher named Velkoth, who had been trying to solve a different problem entirely. The problem of how a single specialist could carry the knowledge of multiple species, not just data, but the actual cognitive frameworks, the way of seeing the world that produced specific kinds of decisions. Velkoth had believed you couldn't truly understand a mind unless you had experienced it from the inside. Dren Vos had thought of this as theoretical for most of his career. An interesting philosophical position, perhaps, but not directly relevant to the intelligence work he actually did. He was not sure he thought that anymore. The question of whether 12 weeks of absorption had changed him was one he had been carefully not asking. He was asking it now, in the observation bay, with the stars doing nothing in particular and the ship's hum a constant beneath everything. The answer was yes. Of course the answer was yes. The program Velkoth had designed was designed to change the specialist, and it had worked exactly as designed, and the reason Dren Vos had been not asking the question was that the implications were ones he wasn't ready to examine directly. He was a different researcher than he had been before Session 1. He was not sure he was a different person. The Keth-Val concept of personhood was more stable than the human concept. The kernel identity more fixed, but he was different in the ways that mattered for the work. He understood things he hadn't understood before. He felt things he didn't have words for. He sat in a quiet room in the evenings and looked at stars and thought about whether rooms could wait. He thought about the joke again, the navigator, the color-coded lists, the specific quality of Gallo's humor in the face of something that cannot be fixed. He understood now why the navigator kept making lists, not because the lists would help, because the act of making them was a declaration. I am still here. I am still thinking. I am still refusing to accept that this is how it ends. He sat in the observation bay for a long time. Then he went back to his quarters and reviewed his notes on the absorption program's history, and found, tucked into a footnote in Velkoth's original theoretical paper, a sentence that he had read before and passed over and was reading differently now. What we learn through absorption is not merely what the subject knows. It is what it feels like to be the subject, and that feeling, once experienced, does not leave. He had filed that away as interesting when he first read it, years ago in training. He understood now that interesting was not the right category. The morning after Session 12, after the report was filed and the Admiral's response had come and gone, Dren Vos returned to the observation bay. He sat in the viewport alcove and looked at the stars and thought about what Calder Mace had told him. The relay station, the 3 years, the whole apparatus of a species that had looked at an incoming threat and decided, rather than simply preparing to fight, to understand how the threat worked so precisely that the fight might be redirected entirely. It was, Dren Vos thought, the joke. The argument in the middle of the repair job. The update to the model of the problem. The refusal to treat the problem as fixed in its current shape when the problem could be studied, could be understood, could be responded to in ways that the problem hadn't anticipated. They had studied the Keth-Val fleet for 3 years. They had built a model. They had designed the response to fit the model. And then they had sent a man into a situation where he would probably be captured, knowing he was the kind of person who would, even under those circumstances, spend 11 weeks making sure someone on the other side understood the truth. That last part was not strategy. Dren Vos was certain of that. Calder Mace's decision to be genuinely present during the absorption sessions, to let himself be known as well as studied, to build a model of Dren Vos out of observed curiosity and then use that model to deliver the truth. That was not the plan. The plan was the relay station, the 3 years of data, the controlled reveal at the moment of maximum strategic impact. The genuine relationship was something that happened alongside the plan. Something that Calder Mace had chosen, in the space the plan didn't fully determine. It was the counterpoint again. Main melody and bassline, saying slightly different things, both true. The review took 63 hours. The verification teams confirmed him the relay station, confirmed the 3 years of transmission to data, confirmed the defense architecture of the outer colonies, which was not under-defended at all. and had been designed with considerable sophistication around the precise angles of attack that 3 years of position data had allowed the colonial administration to model. The 4 senior fleet commanders reconvened. The admiral was present. Dren Voss was brought in to provide supplementary analysis and found himself, for the first time in 22 years, genuinely uncertain what the outcome would be. It went the way his direct channel report had argued it should go. Not easily, there were 4 hours of debate that Dren Voss observed from a secondary seat with the specific quality of attention he now recognized as distinctly influenced by 12 weeks of absorption from a species that stored experience as narrative. He was watching a story. He knew what the right ending was. He didn't know if the right ending was what would happen. It was. The assault authorization was suspended. The diplomatic channels were opened. Admiral Kethsoon did not contest it, which surprised him, until he reviewed the transcript and noticed, in the arguments she made during the 4 hours, that she had presented his original Category 5 evidence twice, in the moments when the debate was closest. She had not changed her mind. She had been changed by evidence, which was not the same thing but was the closest thing to it. Dren Voss added this to his species constants file, then removed it, then added it back under the heading, not species constants. Other things that might be constants, under investigation. 2 months after the stand down, before the diplomatic handover, and after the initial negotiations had established something like a framework for continuing negotiations, Dren Voss received a message through the newly opened diplomatic channel. It was addressed to him personally, which was unusual, and it had been transmitted through the human side of the channel with a note from their diplomatic liaison that described it as a personal communication from a human citizen to a private individual outside the formal diplomatic traffic and requesting that it be delivered if possible. It was delivered. He opened it in his quarters, alone, late in the ship's evening cycle. The message was short. No greeting, no formal opening. I heard the report made it to high command. I heard the stand down. You filed it anyway. I know what that cost you officially. I want you to know someone in this room understood what you were doing and why. Not just the strategy. The rest of it too. Keep updating your model. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. He recognized the handwriting. He had cataloged it in the form of the cognitive patterns that produced it across 12 weeks of absorption. He sat with the message for a long time. He read it 3 times. He did not file it in any of his official logs. He added 1 line to his private notes in the file that had no official designation. The one that had started as a catalog of things that surprised him and had become, over the course of a career, something else. Something that functioned like the human practice of carrying people with you. He wrote, he was right about something important. I'll tell you what it was when I've finished figuring it out. Then he closed the file, turned off the light, and lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the ship, and felt the shape of all the things he now carried. There is a record in the Kethval Intelligence Archive, classified for 40 years and subsequently released to the Historical Public Archive, under the provisions of the Reach Adjustment Transparency Act, of a single researcher's absorption case file spanning 12 sessions, filed between the standard session dates and a supplementary notes file that is twice the length of the sessions themselves. Scholars who have reviewed the notes file describe it as anomalous in the Intelligence Archive's history, formal in structure but personal in register, advancing arguments that the field reports were careful to leave implicit. One scholar, writing in the 3rd decade after the Reach Adjustment, described it as the clearest record she had found of what the negotiations were actually built on, not the strategic intelligence, not the relay station data, which was militarily significant but ultimately superseded by developments, not the fleet movement analysis. What the negotiations were built on was a question, asked by an alien intelligence officer who had spent 12 weeks learning to hear counterpoint, who had spent nights in an observation bay thinking about whether rooms could wait, who had filed a direct channel report against his own career interests, because a human survey specialist had spent 11 weeks making sure someone would see his people clearly. The question was, what does it feel like to be this? The answer, recorded across 1,700 pages of subsequent research, filed by a researcher who became the Kethval Strategic High Command's most cited, author on human cognition who was reprimanded twice and promoted 4 times, who eventually held an endowed chair in contact studies at the Kethval Academy of Strategic Intelligence, who kept a private file he never published that was titled simply, Things That Surprised Me. The answer was everything. Addendum from the personal archive of Dren Voss, absorption specialist, retired. translated from the Keth Val by the Institute for Cross-Species Studies, published posthumously with the consent of his family. The hardest thing about learning to understand a species is that you cannot understand it selectively. You cannot take the parts that are useful for strategic analysis and leave the rest. The mind is not modular in that way. When you enter a mind, when you truly enter it, not just extract data but experience the architecture, feel the shape of how another being has organized its existence. You come out changed by the whole of it, not just the relevant parts, the whole. I entered Calder Mace's mind to extract military intelligence. What I found instead was evidence of a way of being in the world that I had not previously understood was possible. Not better than ours, I want to be precise here, because precision matters, and because the easy romanticism of the explorer who discovers a people and immediately decides they are superior to his own is a failure of analysis I was trained to avoid. Not better. Different in ways that illuminated something I hadn't known I was missing. What I found was a species that had decided, at some level so deep it was no longer conscious, that the correct response to uncertainty was engagement, that the correct response to loss was to keep carrying what was lost, that the correct response to a problem you couldn't solve was to keep arguing about the best way to solve it, not because arguing was pleasant, but because argument was how you updated your model. And an updated model was always better than a fixed one, even when the update was painful. I found a species that had chosen, had built into the architecture of how they trained their young and told their stories and organized their communities, that being wrong was not the end of something. That being wrong was the beginning of something. That the navigator who kept making color-coded lists in the wreck wasn't failing. He was practicing in the dark for the performance that might never come but might. I spent 22 years after the reach adjustment studying the humans formally. I spent considerably longer studying them informally, in the way that you study something that has changed how you think. By continuing to think differently, and noticing when the old ways of thinking would have produced worse answers, and feeling grateful. I want to put on record, for anyone who finds this file, what the absorption program was really designed to do. Not what it said it was designed to do in the official documentation. What it actually did, in the best cases. What it did in my case. It produced empathy. Not sentiment. Empathy. The actual functional state of being able to model another being's experience accurately from the inside. To know not just what they will do, but why. To know not just their strategic profile, but their face. Calder Mace has been dead for 14 years. He died of a cardiac failure in the 62nd year of his life, on the survey vessel we had repaired and returned to him, somewhere in the outer reach that is no longer disputed. I learned of his death through a diplomatic communication that was not addressed to me, but that I was copied on because of my long research relationship with the human outer colonies. I sat in my office and I thought about his hands. I thought about the water glass. I thought about the specific counterpoint expression that meant he was saying one thing and feeling something adjacent to it, and how I had spent 12 weeks learning to read the gap between them. I thought about the message he sent through the diplomatic channel, the one I never published. I keep it in the Things That Surprised Me file. I keep updating the file. It's very long now. The last entry reads, "He was right. I figured it out. What I was supposed to understand was not the strategy. It was not the relay station, or the fleet movements, or the cognitive architecture analysis. All of those things were real and true and important, and I documented them with appropriate thoroughness. What I was supposed to understand was him, specifically, what he was like, what it felt like to be the kind of person who would spend 11 weeks in a gray room under genuine threat, making sure that someone who might be used to plan his species' subjugation would see his people clearly. What it felt like to be the kind of person for whom that mattered. I understood it. Eventually, I am still updating my model. I think that is the correct posture. I think it is, in fact, the only posture that does justice to what I was shown. Dren Voss Year 41 of the Reach Adjustment